Walter Pruitt had been working the overnight desk at Meridian Tower for 11 years, long enough to know that the building had its own kind of grammar. The way the elevators hummed differently after midnight, the way the marble lobby held cold even in July, the way certain people walked through the front doors like they owned the air around them, and certain others walked through like they were apologizing for existing. He knew which category he fell into. 53 years old, divorced, living in a 2-bedroom rental in Etobicoke that he shared with a cat named Biscuit and a collection of half-finished crossword puzzles. His uniform was clean, but the collar had started to fray at the left side, and he'd been meaning to replace it for 4 months. He drove a 2009 Civic with a crack in the rear bumper that he'd fixed with electrical tape. He ate his dinner, usually a sandwich from the Tim Hortons 3 blocks over, at the security desk at 1 a.m., when the building was quiet and the only sound was the ventilation system breathing through the walls. He was not a man anyone looked at twice. That was the thing about Walter. He had spent so long being invisible that he had gotten very good at watching. He noticed things. He noticed that the woman who worked on the 14th floor always took the stairs when she was stressed and the elevator when she was calm. He noticed that the man from the investment firm on the 22nd floor changed his cologne every 3 weeks, like he was trying on different versions of himself. He noticed that the cleaning crew laughed more when their supervisor wasn't on shift, and on the night of the 17th of March, he noticed that something was wrong with the man on the 31st floor. The 31st floor belonged to Halcyon Capital Group. Most people in Toronto's financial district knew the name without knowing much else about it. Halcyon was the kind of firm that did not advertise, did not appear in profile pieces, did not send representatives to panels or conferences. It managed money for a small number of very specific clients. Old money, institutional money, the kind of capital that had been accumulating quietly for generations. Its founder and chairman had built it from a single office in 1994 into something that now oversaw, by Walter's rough estimation from the occasional business magazine left behind in the lobby, somewhere north of $4 billion in assets. That founder was Desmond Aldrich. Walter had seen Desmond Aldrich perhaps 200 times over 11 years. He came in early, usually before 7, and left late, usually after 9. He took the elevator to 31, said good morning or good evening in a voice that was low and unhurried, and that was the extent of their interaction. He wore the same rotation of plain navy and charcoal suits, nothing flashy, nothing that would distinguish him from any other man in his 60s walking through a downtown building. No cufflinks, no watch that Walter could identify as expensive, a wedding ring that had gone from gold to worn to something between the two. He drove himself. Walter had noticed that the first time, no driver, no town car, just a dark green Land Rover that was at least 8 years old and always parked in the same spot on level 2 of the parkade. He carried his own bag. He held the door for the cleaning staff. In 11 years, Walter had never seen Desmond Aldrich raise his voice. He had also never seen him afraid. Until the 17th of March at 11:47 p.m. Walter was at the desk when the elevator opened and Desmond walked out. That alone was unusual. The chairman almost never worked this late. But it was the way he walked that made Walter look up from his crossword. There was something clipped about it, something contained, like a man holding very still on the inside while the outside kept moving. Desmond crossed the lobby toward the exit, then stopped. He stood with his back to Walter, looking out through the glass doors at the street. It was raining. The fine cold rain that Toronto does in March, the kind that isn't quite sleet, but doesn't feel like anything gentler either. A black SUV was idling at the curb. It had been there for about 20 minutes. Walter had noticed it because it hadn't moved, and things that didn't move for long periods of time in front of a building at midnight were things Walter paid attention to. Desmond stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to the sitting area near the east wall. 4 chairs, a low table, a plant that Walter watered on Thursdays, and sat down. He put his bag on the floor, folded his hands, and looked at nothing. Walter watched him for a moment. Then he picked up his sandwich, stood up, and walked over. "Mr. Aldrich," he said, "can I get you anything?" Desmond looked up. He seemed to come back from somewhere far away. "No," he said. "Thank you, Walter." It was the first time in 11 years that Desmond Aldrich had used his name. Walter stood there for a moment longer than was strictly professional. Something in the older man's face, the careful, controlled blankness of it, reminded him of something he couldn't immediately place. Then he could. It was the face his daughter had made the night she'd called to tell him her marriage was falling apart. The face of someone trying very hard not to show how serious something was. "That SUV out front," Walter said. He kept his voice even, the way you talk to someone when you don't want to spook them. "It's been there since about 11:20. Black Escalade, no plate visible from here. The driver hasn't gotten out." Desmond was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Is there someone I should be calling?" A pause. "No." Walter nodded slowly. He was about to return to his desk when something made him stop. A small thing, the kind of thing that would have been easy to dismiss. Through the glass wall of the lobby, he could see the elevator bank. The service elevator, the one on the far left, the one that opened onto the rear corridor and the loading dock, had its light on. The indicator showed it was on 31, and it was moving down. Walter knew that elevator's schedule. He had written it himself in his second year on the job, after a string of after-hours incidents had made the building manager decide they needed tighter documentation. The service elevator was used by cleaning staff between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. After that, it was locked out unless someone had a key card, and only 3 people in the building had key cards for that elevator after hours. Desmond Aldrich was one of them, but Desmond Aldrich was sitting 15 feet away from Walter, with his hands folded, watching the rain. Walter did not make a scene. That was not his way. He walked back to his desk with the unhurried pace of a man returning to his sandwich, sat down and pulled up the security camera feed on his monitor. He cycled through to camera 7, which covered the service elevator corridor on the lobby level. The elevator opened at 11:52 p.m. A man stepped out. Walter recognized him immediately. It was Desmond's executive assistant, a man in his mid-40s named Preston Cole, who had been with Halcyon for 6 years, and who always wore a pressed shirt and carried a leather portfolio, and who had, in Walter's estimation, the kind of smile that arrived slightly before it was needed and stayed slightly after it was done. Walter had never trusted that smile. He'd never said anything about it to anyone, because it wasn't the kind of thing you could say without sounding foolish. Preston moved quickly. He was not carrying his portfolio. He was carrying a hard-shell briefcase that Walter had not seen before, compact, dark gray, and he moved through the rear corridor with the particular focus of a man who was hoping not to be seen. Walter watched him cross to the loading dock exit, push through the door, and disappear. He glanced at the camera that covered the rear lane behind the building. A car was waiting. Not the black Escalade, that was still out front. This was a silver sedan. It was running. Preston got in the passenger side, and the car moved away immediately, turning north onto the side street and gone within seconds. Walter sat very still for a moment. He thought about what he had just seen. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions. He believed in giving things the benefit of the doubt, in waiting for more information before deciding what something meant. But he had also been watching human behavior in this building for 11 years, and what he had just watched had the unmistakable shape of something that was not supposed to happen. He thought about the key card, about the fact that Preston Cole should not have had access to the service elevator after 11. He thought about what was on the 31st floor. He thought about the way Desmond Aldrich was sitting across the lobby with the careful face of a man who was already in the middle of something very bad. Walter picked up his pen. He tore a strip from the edge of his crossword page. He had been doing the Saturday Globe puzzle, which he rarely finished, and he wrote 6 words on it. Then he folded it twice, stood up, and walked back across the lobby. Desmond looked up when Walter approached. Walter held out the folded strip of paper without saying anything. The older man took it with a steadiness that Walter respected. He unfolded it, read it, and went very still. The paper said, "Your assistant just left through the loading dock." Desmond looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up at Walter, and something shifted in his face. Not panic, not the kind of alarm that makes people loud and reactive, but something quieter and more precise, a recalibration. The look of a man who had just confirmed something he had been trying not to confirm. "When?" he said. 11:52. He took the service elevator down. "Had a briefcase I've not seen before. A car was waiting in the rear lane, silver sedan. I didn't catch the plate. He was gone in under a minute." Desmond was quiet. The rain clicked softly against the glass. He has a key card for the service elevator, Walter added. I don't know how. After 11, that elevator requires a management-level card. I only know of 3 that were issued. I know, Desmond said. Something in the way he said it told Walter that this was not new information exactly, that he had suspected something was wrong, that the suspicion had been building, and that tonight it had taken a shape he could no longer talk himself out of. Walter recognized that feeling. He had had it once years ago when he'd started finding things in his own house that didn't add up. A receipt for somewheres his wife said she hadn't been, a name repeated in a phone bill. The feeling of a story you've been avoiding finally arriving. Is there anything you need? Walter asked. Desmond looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, careful, appraising, something underneath it that might have been gratitude, or might have been something older and sadder than that. Why are you telling me this? He said, not unkindly. Genuinely. Walter thought about it. Because if it were me, he said, I'd want to know. What happened next, Walter learned in pieces over the following weeks, through a combination of what Desmond chose to tell him and what eventually became public in the financial press, filtered through language dense enough that most people would not have understood it, and plain enough that Walter, who had done the business section crosswords for going on 12 years, more or less could. Preston Cole had been providing information to a competing firm for 7 months. Not trade secrets in the dramatic sense. No documents stolen in the night, no classified files smuggled out in a false-bottomed bag. It was subtler and more damaging than that. He had been feeding a detailed picture of Halcyon's positioning on 3 significant private equity deals, enough information, delivered at the right moments, to allow a competitor to undercut them on 2 and stall the 3rd indefinitely. By Walter's estimation, reading between the lines of a Globe and Mail piece that appeared 6 weeks later, the damage was somewhere in the range of $40 million. Perhaps more. The hard-shell briefcase, it turned out, contained a portable drive, 6 years of institutional access, copied with enough care that it had taken the firm's forensic auditors nearly 2 weeks to map exactly what had been taken. Preston had been given the after-hours key card. This was the part that Walter had wondered about. Through a facility management request that had been approved during a period when Desmond had been in Vancouver for a family matter, and the administrative oversight had fallen to Preston himself. He had approved his own access. It was the kind of thing that only worked in an organization that trusted its people. And Preston Cole had been trusted. The silver sedan, it emerged, belonged to a woman who worked for a private intelligence firm based in Calgary that had been retained, through several intermediaries, by a competitor based in New York. Preston had been paid through a consulting arrangement that, on paper, was entirely legitimate. None of this came out quickly, and none of it was Walter's to tell. He told the investigators what he'd seen, the time, the camera footage, the direction of the car, and they thanked him with the brisk efficiency of people who had been doing this for a long time and found his account useful but not surprising. He was not called to testify. His name did not appear anywhere. That was all right with Walter. He was not looking for his name to appear anywhere. He saw Desmond Aldrich in the lobby on a Tuesday morning in early April, about 3 weeks after everything had begun to unravel. It was just after 7, which was Desmond's usual time. Walter was finishing the last hour of his night shift. The lobby was beginning to fill with the morning crowd, the early arrivals, the ones who came in before 8 because they liked the quiet, or because they had calls to Asia, or because they were the kind of people who defined themselves by how early they started. Desmond came through the front doors, and he looked. Walter searched for the word, unburdened. Not happy exactly, and not unaffected, but there was something different in the way he moved, something fractionally easier, as though a weight that had been pressing down for a long time had been redistributed somewhere. He stopped at the desk. "Walter," he said. "Mr. Aldrich." Desmond set his bag down and looked at him with a directness that Walter was not used to receiving from anyone, let alone from men who managed $4 billion and had never in 11 years needed anything from him. "I want to thank you," he said, "for what you did." Walter shook his head slightly. "I just told you what I saw." "That's not nothing," Desmond said. They stood there for a moment, in the early morning, quiet of the lobby, the sound of the city beginning to come awake beyond the glass. Walter thought about the 11 years of good mornings and good evenings that had passed between them without either of them knowing much about the other. He thought about how strange it was, sometimes, the way people existed alongside each other for years and years and never quite landed in the same moment until something forced them there. "How's your cat?" Desmond said. Walter looked at him. "My cat? Biscuit." A small, genuine smile. "You mentioned her once. About 5 years ago. You'd just taken her to the vet. I don't think you were talking to me. You were on the phone, but I was standing nearby." Walter did not know what to do with that. He laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that doesn't perform itself. "She's fine," he said. "She ate my last crossword book, but otherwise she's fine." Desmond smiled again, wider this time, the kind that reached his eyes and seemed to surprise him slightly. He picked up his bag. "I'll be in late today," he said. "Some meetings uptown." "I'll be off shift by then," Walter said. "I know." He paused. "Walter, if there's anything you need, I mean that simply. Not as an obligation, just as one person to another." Walter nodded. He didn't make promises or deflect or say anything that would turn the moment into something it wasn't. He just nodded the way you nod when someone says something true and you want them to know you heard it. Desmond Aldrich walked to the elevator. Walter watched him go, then turned back to his desk. He had 40 minutes left on his shift. The crossword was waiting, Saturday's puzzle which he still hadn't finished 2 weeks running. He picked up his pen and found his place. 14 across, a form of quiet authority. 7 letters. He thought about it for a moment. Then he wrote, "Dignity." He sat back in his chair in the lobby of Meridian Tower, while the city outside kept moving and the morning kept arriving, and he felt, for the first time in a long while, exactly like himself.